Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 1 through 3 in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. I want to begin by just talking about the Torah, also known as the Pentateuch. The word Torah means that's Hebrew for the words either law or instruction, and you can take it either way. It actually both fit nicely. The term Pentateuch just means the five-part book, and so the five parts that we're speaking of are the first five books of the Hebrew Scriptures of the Old Testament. And that's going to be the beginning focus of our study. Now, we're not going to get past Genesis this time. We're going to be in Genesis for a while, but then we'll go to the other books as well. Let's look at those: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Genesis is going to start off with creation, and by the time we end, we will see the Israelites going into and staying in Egypt. Exodus then is going to pick up in Egypt, and it's going to give us the story of the deliverance of Egypt from Egypt, and how the Israelites go to Mount Sinai. They will be given the law and the tabernacle. So it's the establishment of the covenant. Leviticus tells us what to do with the tabernacle. It's the laws of worship. And the book of Numbers, it picks up where they are still at Sinai, but now they're going to go through the wilderness, and we'll see the wilderness wanderings in the book of Numbers. Um, and that will take us until they're almost ready to go into the promised land. And some 40 years have passed by this time. And they're ready to go in, but now Deuteronomy picks up and gives the law again to the new generation with special emphasis to those who are entering into the land. Now, I have to talk for just a moment about something called the documentary hypothesis. It was noticed, just a casual reading of the book of Genesis, as well as Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But it's most obvious in Exodus that you have two different designations for God. I put here Jehovah. Actually, it's probably they didn't have the letter Y back in Old Testament times, so probably pronounced Yahweh. But here, for the purpose of the hypothesis, I'm going to call it Jehovah. That was the German way of saying it. And Elohim is just the Hebrew word for God. Jehovah is the name of God. So just like I have both a name and a title, I'm a human being. That would be, I guess, my description of what I am. But that's not my name. Likewise, God has both a name and a title. God, Elohim, Jehovah, that's his name. And it was suggested back in the 1700s by Jean Ostruck that perhaps as Moses was sitting down to write the Pentateuch, the Torah, that he utilized two different source documents. That some of the documents that he had, some of the manuscripts that he had, describe God by using his name, Jehovah, and that others describe God by using his title, Elohim, and that these could be seen, the influence of these could be seen as you read through the book. You start in Genesis chapter 1, and God is called Elohim. You get to chapter 2, and he is called Jehovah Elohim, where both names are used. And same thing in chapter 3, and then a bit later it goes back to just Elohim, and it goes back and forth, not always within just a few verses, but sometimes a whole chapter using one title, and then the next chapter or a few chapters later using the other title. And so this was his theory. Next, William DeWitt comes along and he says, well, that works for Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, but it doesn't really work very well for Deuteronomy. So maybe that was penned by some other author. Maybe Moses wasn't involved, especially when you notice that at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses dies. I don't think Moses wrote that part, where, and Moses died and God buried his body. No, no, no. That sounds like it was written by somebody else's pen, and that was DeWitt. Next, we have Holfeld, who tries to take the Elohim sections and say, well, they're a bit different. I think sometimes they are. And so he subdivided them into E1 and E2. And not to be outdone, now we have Wellhausen, Julius Wellhausen, in the late 1800s. And this is after Charles Darwin had published his Origin of the Species. Wellhausen wants to take those sorts of theories, those sorts of evolutionary theories, and apply them to the Pentateuch. How this book actually evolved from a number of sources just by chance. And so he he said, well, there's the Jehovah sections, there are the Elohim sections, but then there are also the book of Deuteronomy. It doesn't really fit into either one of those. And finally, there are those sections that would be of special interest to priests, having to do with sacrifices and having to do with genealogy. So the P section. And this became known as the JEDP theory. The more proper way to call it is the documentary hypothesis. And that became uh, part of the regular teaching of a lot of people that if there even was a Moses, he had nothing to do with this. These were all much later writers coming about in the uh, just before and just after the Babylonian captivity, and they just made it all up, and then somebody took all of these four and threw them all together, and out came Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That theory has been largely discarded by all sorts of scholarship, not just evangelical, but even non-Christian scholarship. They put that aside when they noted the way that the books were designed. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't any sources that were used like this, and that actually might work. But when they noticed that the way the books were designed, and we're going to see this all throughout Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, not so much in Numbers and Deuteronomy, that there are very carefully crafted designs to these books. It's not poetry, but there's a certain amount of parallelism in the actual design of the books. So we'll see that as we go. And I want to say Wellhausen's theory by these scholars have really put Wellhausen's theory aside. They said that was some nice observations, but they don't really explain how the sort of care got into putting these books together. So let's start in Genesis. I notice I call it the book of beginnings because there's the beginning of a lot of different things in this book. And chapters 1 through 11 in Genesis, the first half of the book, is going to describe four events that will be predominant. So that we'll see the creation, we'll see the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel incident. And those four events. Then in chapter 12, we are actually at the end of chapter 11, we're introduced to Abraham. Back then he's called Abram. But these four people, Abraham, and then his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob and Joseph. Now there's other sons there, but these are the key ones that the story is going to follow. These four people, and notice that's the bigger part of the book, chapter 12 through 50. That's most of the book, which makes us look at Genesis chapters 1 through 11 maybe as introductory in these four events. In those four events, it's looking at the human race as a whole, even though at times the human race is only two people. For example, in the case of creation and the fall, the flood, there's considerably more. The Tower of Babel, there's considerably more. But the camera is looking at everybody who is now alive at that point. That changes when we get to Genesis chapter 12. Now we're just going to see the family of Abraham. And everyone else is only mentioned as they interact with Abraham and his descendants. In that first section, Genesis 1 through 11, we have a period of 2,000 years plus. Exactly how long? Remember I said last time, I'm not going to try to guess that, what I called prehistory as to how, but it's at least 2,000 years. And counting, I would say. When we come to the story of Abraham and his descendants, at the most, maybe 250 years. Most of it's focused on quite a bit less. And notice how the clock slows down even as the camera angle focuses only on this one family. So with that, let's jump into Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, where we start off in the beginning. What a great way to start a book. In the beginning of the book. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice God, and we already said that that's the term Elohim. Now that im ending in Hebrew is plural, but we should, and sometimes if, depending on the context, you can look at Elohim and you can say, it's speaking of gods in the plural, but it's not here. Because Hebrew is an inflected language, and that means when you look at the verb, at the word created, you can tell how many people are doing it. That's not a group of people, not God's plural doing this, but that is Elohim singular. Only one individual is creating the heavens and the earth. So we've properly translated God created the heaven. Oh, and you say, well, why is the word Elohim plural? I think that might be because of something called, and we're going to see it again in a bit, the plural of majesty, when you want to describe something really big and really wondrous. In fact, in just a second, we're going to see a little bit of that as God created the heavens and the earth. Now, let me just say, the pagan creation accounts described how their gods were created. We don't see God being created here. He already is. In the beginning, he's not being created. He's already doing something. He's creating the heavens and the earth. And notice how the word heavens is plural. Shamayim is how you say that in Hebrew. It's actually sort of dual, not plural. It's um, because you point in one direction, there's heavens up there, and you point in another direction, there's heavens up there. Um, and so a little bit like when God is really big and the heavens are really big, and you look up there, and every which way you look up there, they are there. I have my own little pet theory. It is probably wrong, but I'm going to share it anyway. In Hebrew, the word sham is just means over there. And so Shemayim is, I like to think of it as the up there places. Now, that's probably wrong, but I'm going to I'm going to stick by it until it's definitely proven wrong. We'll see. I don't take it that seriously. How It's a good way to remember that, though. So the pagan creation accounts described how their gods were created. There's no creation of God here. It's just the creation of everything else. And the God of the Hebrews we're being told, created the heavens and the earth, created everything. Next, we go to the next verse, and the earth was unformed and unfilled. In Hebrew, that almost rhymes. It was tohu vabohu. Va is the word and. Tohu vabohu. Or we might say topsy-turvy. Or we might say, I like desolate and deserted. But I'm going to stick with unformed and unfilled. And darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. So you have heavens and earth, and you have waters, and the Spirit of God is moving, hovering, caring for the term's rather specific there. It's used later on in Deuteronomy of a bird hovering over its nest, and it seems to be a little bit of a care there. And we're going to see this again when we come to the flood narrative, where again we're going to see the Spirit of God, or actually the word spirit, ruach is the Hebrew word for spirit, can also be translated wind. Now, I don't think this is the wind of God necessarily. I think Spirit of God is correct. But remember that you can have something there, and later on we're going to see the wind of God at work over waters. So just hold that thought, but moving over the surface of the waters. So that term unformed and unfilled, I'm going to suggest gives us an outline of the rest of this chapter. So unformed and unfilled, and now we have on day 3, God says, let there be light, and there was light, and he divides the light from the darkness, and the light is the day, and the darkness is called night, and everything is good. And so you have light, and you have the light divided from the darkness, the first day, the first night. You come to day 2, and there is also a division. So I'm seeing some divisions here were there the water and sky, because God said, let there be light, and now God divides the water from that are below the rakia is the term that's used, the expanse or the firmament, or if you look up the sky, it looks like there's this big dome up there, and that's how it appears. I know it's not, but he divides the waters that are under that from the waters that are over it. If I go out in fact, it was raining earlier today, so if I went outside and looked up, and I'd see some water up there, and it's coming down, it's raining, and then there's water down here. And God looks at that and he divides them. And next we move to day 3, where I have a third division. This time the dry land is divided from the sea. So I have division, 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 and dry land appears. And then God brings forth on the dry land vegetation. Now, no animals yet. It's just vegetation. So living things, yes, but all plant life. So do you notice there's a division of light and darkness? There's a division from the waters that are up there and the waters down here, and then there's a division from the dry land versus the sea. And it said again on day 3, and it was good. That wasn't said about day 2. Maybe it wasn't. It wasn't baked yet. It wasn't finished yet. But we read, and it was good. Now we come to day 4. and we have light bearers, the things that hold the light. Now we know that these are the sun, the moon, and the stars, but the word sun isn't used because the Hebrew word for sun um, was also used to describe pagan god, a pagan god. And the writer wants to make us absolutely certain there's no paganism here. This is just God doing this. So the greater light and the lesser light, and you understand who that is. And so notice the lights are put there to be that which gives the light that had been made on day one. You say, well, how can there be light on day one if there was, if the sun and moon and stars don't come on day four? That's the whole point. Is on day one you have light and darkness. On day four, the things that give those, the things that are associated with it, the things that hold the light, if I can call it that, are made. And you're going to see how this plays out in the next few days. So that's day four. Day five, now you have the things that go in the water and the sky, the fish and the birds each fill the water and the sky. There is a population that is made, it's filled. And you come then to day six, on day three, remember how you had the dry land divided from the sea and the vegetation? Now on day six, the dry land is filled with the land animals and mankind. And of course, they're going to eat the vegetation, so everything's working together. And I turn to the next chapter, in chapter 2, and I have the Sabbath rest given, where God is the work is completed, God is finished. Not that He's tired, but He's completed the work, and the work stops because there's no more work to do. It's all done, and He ordains a Sabbath rest, not just for God to take the rest on day 7, but that there would be a continuing memorial where this entire idea of a week. Remember, there's nothing in astronomy that makes you think of a week. 7 days. There's nothing that the moon does specifically over only a 7-day period. The only way you come up with the idea of a week is from the Bible. That's where it came from. This idea of the week culminating in that Sabbath rest. Now, I want to go back to chapter 1, verse 26, on day 6, where we have the creation of mankind. And God said, notice the let us make man, where there is a plural there. Again, I think what we probably have here is that plural of majesty. It reminds me a bit of when the King of England, and right now there is a king over in England, and sometimes when they'll give a royal decree, I don't know how many decrees they do these days, but if they do one, they will say, "It is we have decided to do such and such." And you say, "Well, wait a minute, I thought you were king. I thought you got to decide." He's speaking in the royal, in the majestic we. There's even a place in Ezra where the emperor of the Persian Empire does the same thing. But here is God doing that. Now, He's only going to do this here in Genesis 1. He'll do it in Genesis 3. In Genesis 11, that's the only place we're going to see it. But we do see it here. Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them, that is mankind, let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. So notice, man is made in the image of God. You say, in what way is man made in the image of God? What we're going to see in the next verse. Hold that thought. And then that's repeated just in case you miss it. God created man in His own image, and then He says the same thing, just in opposite order. In the image of God, He created him. And then He adds to that, male and female, He created them. So both, all of mankind in both genders, male, female. Notice there's not a third gender there. It's male, female, not something else. He created them. But the question is, in what way is man in the image of God? And as I said, we're going to see that in the next verse. Verse 28, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Here it is. And rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. In this context, and I'm not saying there aren't other ways as well, But in the context of Genesis 1, the way in which man was made in the image of God is that he is acting as God's deputy to rule in place of God, not taking God's place in the sense that he's rebellious against God, but no, in the sense that he is God's representative. He is here to rule over the rest of creation here upon planet Earth. Now, we come to chapter 2, and after that section of the Sabbath, we're going to have a separate creation account. And this brings up the question, why are there two separate accounts of creation? Well, I think there are two separate accounts of creation for the same reason that there are four separate accounts in the New Testament of the life and death and burial and resurrection of Jesus. It's to give us a picture of the event from different perspectives. And the same thing happens here. It's not a different creation. It's still man and woman being created. But we're going to see the story differently as it is told differently from a different perspective. So let's jump in. Genesis chapter 1, we have the heavens and the earth created in 6 days. Genesis 2, there's not going to be any time element mentioned. It's going to be focusing primarily on the creation of man and the woman. There will be some other things too, but that's the main focus. That's the, can I call it, that's the punchline. In Genesis 1, we have the climactic moment coming. That's why we read Genesis chapters 1, verses 26 and 27, when God creates mankind. In Genesis 2, the man is created earlier, and the climactic moment comes when God makes the woman and brings her to the man. She's the so what in chapter 2. That's cool. I like that. So we start off in chapter 2 and verses 1 through 3, where creation is complete and the heavens and the earth have been created, and God finished his work, and he ordains the Sabbath. And when I was younger, a lot younger, I used to say way back then that whoever did the chapter divisions, they really should have put this in the previous chapter, because it finishes that whole 6th day and then 7th day. Let me just say I was wrong. I think the chapter division works really nicely. But I didn't know that much when I first started reading this and when I first started even teaching the Bible. So creation is complete in verses 1 through 3. Next, we have man created, but only the male, not the female. And he is formed from the dust of the ground. And then God breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. Although the Hebrew says the breath of lives, plural. Not that he has a bunch of different lives. No. It's, again, describing something that's magnificent. Life is a wonderful thing. And so it's described in the plural there. And he's formed from the dust, and he is placed there. And next we find out that there is a garden that the man is placed into. Now, when you said a garden in the ancient world, you're describing, trees and plants and things like that. But also, a garden always had a wall around it, usually with only one entrance coming in and out. And I'm not sure if that always has to be the case, but it usually is, and it is going to be here in the story here, which we'll see not now, but when we get to the next chapter. But there are trees that are planted by God, and then there are rivers that are flowing in and out of the garden, and they are all given names, where the two trees are given names, and the rivers are given names. The trees, there's the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then there's the tree of life. And then the rivers themselves are given names, and some of those are familiar to us. So let's go to a map and take a look at that. Two of the rivers that are mentioned as coming out of the garden are the Tigris. Now, it's not given by that name. It's called the Hiddekel in Hebrew, but that was another name for the Tigris. And then the Euphrates. But then the other two rivers are not that familiar, if they're even known. So 4 rivers in total, and people have looked at these 2 rivers and they've asked the question, well, does this tell us where the Garden of Eden was located? And the traditional location is down here in southern Mesopotamia. We already looked at the map in a previous class. Southern Mesopotamia, where the rivers actually come together. Was Eden located there? Actually, if you follow the rivers, and my map doesn't do it justice because the rivers, I stopped following them in the northern section when they got sort of small, but they both come up to this place in the north, and then they both move eastward in the direction as I go upriver. And so if I went to the source of those two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, I'd find myself in this area that the ancients described as the land of Urartu. We're going to see it later on as Ararat. So was Eden located there? Was it located in southern Mesopotamia? If you ask a Jewish rabbi where was Eden, he's probably going to say, oh, that was in Jerusalem. And yeah, I'd say, well, that's as good a location as any. But I'm just going to say, where was Eden? I don't know. Remember that we're going to see a flood, and that might change some things. So I'm just going to be carefully neutral and say, I don't know where Eden was. Let's continue. We had trees and rivers in the garden given names, and now the man is assigned the task of guarding and keeping the garden. So he's going to tend it, keep it. There's a term there that has the idea of guarding it. You say, well, do I have to guard it from somebody? Is there some sort of hostility? Maybe that's a little bit of a warning about what's going to happen in the next chapter. But yeah, if so, it's a veiled warning, not necessarily all that clear. But he's in the garden and he has a duty to perform. And now we come to the pivotal point in the entire chapter where there is a warning against eating of the forbidden fruit. Chapter 2 and verse 16, here's the warning. And the Lord God, by the way, did you notice how it's Lord God instead of just God? That switched when we came here to chapter 2. So the Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely. I mean, uh, just have at it, enjoy. Even the tree of life. And I imagine if I had heard about all these trees, the first thing I might be sampling is the tree of life. Verse 17, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it, you shall surely die. Now, when it says you shall surely die, it says it twice. Dying, you will die. And I remember one old Bible teacher said, oh, see, that's spiritual death and that's physical death. And there's somebody who apparently didn't know that much Hebrew. Because in Hebrew, you say, no, no, no. That when you say it twice like that, what you're saying, it's really going to happen. So our translation is right on board. You shall surely die. It's really going to happen. That's actually a good translation. Yeah, if they had translated it literally, you might know it literally, but you wouldn't know what it meant. So our translators have done a great job here. But notice the promise, in the day you eat of it, if you do, then you're going to die that day. We have the command against the forbidden fruit. Next, we have man in need of a helper for the task that was given him. And the statement is made, it's not good for man to be alone. We will provide a helper for him. And so a helper in that task. Notice how the task and the helper sort of go together. But instead of the woman being created at this point, one more thing happens. See, we had the trees and the rivers and the garden that were given names. Well, now the animals that God has made are brought to the man so that he can name them. So I had a naming where God had given names to the trees and the rivers, and now the animals in the gardens are given names by man. And he names them, and whatever he names them, that becomes his name. It's only after this that God takes the man and causes a deep sleep to fall upon him. And as he sleeps, God performs what sounds like a little bit like a surgical operation, and he takes from his side. Now, we've translated it rib because your ribs are on your side, and that works. But it doesn't, the term is used for other things besides just your bodily rib. So from your side, from your rib, you can take it either way. And the woman is taken, and she is created from that. Um, so remember, man was formed from dust. The woman is formed from the side of man. And I think there's something absolutely beautiful about that. It reminds me, as the bride is brought from her husband, there's a sense in which Jesus did the same thing when he was purchasing his bride upon the cross. Remember how a soldier came with a spear and pushed it into his side, so that as blood and water flowed out to give birth to what would eventually be God's special people, in the same way, we have this surgical operation that is described. And so I think there's maybe a little typology here as we see this. Well, we come to the end then. They've both been created, and God brings the woman to the man, and it closes with a song, and creation is complete, and they are naked, and they are unashamed, and God is there, and everything is good. Everything is very good. Until I get to chapter 3. And in chapter 3, a new character is introduced. Enter the serpent. Now, notice he's called the serpent. Satan is not mentioned. The word Satan is not mentioned anywhere in Genesis 3, anywhere in Genesis, anywhere in the first 5 books of Moses. The Satan will be seen, and notice how I called it the Satan, that's actually a title, will be seen later on in the Old Testament. So we'll see him, but not yet. And instead, the serpent shows up, and the serpent is more crafty than any beast of the field that God had made. And the serpent speaks now to the woman and begins a temptation of the woman. And it just seems to me there's going on more here than meets the eye. But that's the way the story is being told. And the temptation ultimately says, and God knows that if you eat, then you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And she decides she wants to be like God. Now, you say, wait a second, if I'd have read back in chapter 1, she already was like God. The male and female, they were like God. They were in the image of God. But she wants more or different or something. And so she takes of the fruit and she eats, and she also gives to her husband with her. By the way, that's where he had been, with her. You say, where was he during that temptation? Sounds like he was with her, and he eats. So they had been created in the image of God, but now they're seeking more, and they disobey what God had given. Here it is, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she also gave to her husband with her. See, he seems to have been there, and he ate. Now, the results of disobedience, they eat, and immediately their eyes are open. There's a change in the way they see things. There's a self-awareness of their nakedness. And so there's an understanding of both their nakedness and their wrongdoing, and they're overcome with shame. There's a shameful thing going on. And they try to rectify it. They make for themselves clothes of fig leaves. Now, I read that probably 100 times or more. And I had never bothered to look up fig leaves, not from a biblical perspective, but just from a agricultural perspective. One of my students did this a while back and said, hey, prof, take a look at this. And you don't have to look very far. Let me just say, fig leaves are toxic. Now, figs are great. I've eaten figs. I've stood under fig trees in Israel, and I haven't come across them in other places. But I didn't go rub against the leaves. I didn't avoid them. I didn't know any better at the time. But if you take the leaf, and especially if you pull the leaf off where a little bit of the sap comes out, not only is it messy, but if you rub it on your skin, it can blister your skin. You would get the same results if you tried to clothe yourself with poison ivy, sort of get an idea of what that's like. And so I can't help but wonder if the readers are supposed to read that part about they're making themselves fig leaves to cover themselves, and the whole crowd that's reading just starts laughing at the implications. Like I said, I missed it for lots and lots of years, but they attempt to hide their shame. And this brings up the question, wait a minute, the promise had been, in the day you eat of it, you will certainly die. Why didn't they die? You expect to read, if you've read the previous chapter and are taking God's promise seriously, you expect to read, and they ate of the fruit, and they fell down, and they died, and end of story. And they don't. And very oftentimes people will say, when they're asked why didn't they die, they'll say, well, they died spiritually. And let me say, I believe that they did die spiritually. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1 talks about how we were dead in our trespasses and sins in which we formerly walked. And so, yes, I think there is such a thing as a spiritual death. But Genesis doesn't mention that. In fact, the Pentateuch doesn't mention that. In fact, the entire Old Testament does not specifically mention that. And so I go back to, I don't think this was a spiritual death. I think there's something more here. Why didn't they die? And I think the answer is given at the end of the story, when we get to verse 21, where God takes an animal. Here it is, Genesis 3:21. And the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. Garments of skin presupposes that there's an animal out there with no skin on. In other words, it presupposes the death of an animal. And the ancient rabbis got this. They looked at this and they viewed this as the very first sacrifice, the very first animal sacrifice. And I think they were right. I do think they were correct. That the animal, or I'm assuming one animal, maybe more, but the animal died as a result of their disobedience, and they are clothed and they are not killed because the animal died as their substitute. And I think that's why they didn't die. I think it's that God had provided a substitute. It's the same reason we don't die eternally, is because we have a substitute too. We have one who died in our place. We have Jesus who gave his life, died in our place so that we could be clothed with his righteousness. Well, God shows up and he questions the serpent and he questions the woman and he questions the man. And then he begins to give a promise. We're not going to look at all the questioning. That would take too long. But here in chapter 3 and verse 15 is a promise which is sort of the gospel in brief, very brief, very sketchy, where he is speaking still to the serpent, and God says to the serpent, "I will put enmity." Now that word enmity means hatred or eneminess. That's not really a word. I just made it up. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed, the seed of the serpent, and her seed, the seed of the woman. He, that's the seed of, that's her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Now, that's almost like a poetic riddle. And we're going to try to unravel it a little bit this time, and then next time we'll unravel it a bit more because it actually has two aspects to it. First of all, notice we've got the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman, and I'm going to put enmity between them. Ultimately, and I don't find this out in the Old Testament. I really don't find it out until I get to the New Testament, where I see Satan being described. For example, in Revelation chapter 12, he's described as that old serpent, the devil. Well, by calling him the serpent, it's drawing our attention all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. And so I think ultimately that the seed of the serpent speaks of Satan and those who follow him. And then when I look at the seed of the woman, again, ultimately, eventually, I'm going to see that fulfilled through Eve, maybe a little bit later through Mary. Okay, it's okay to see them both, in the person of Jesus, who is the ultimate son of Eve and actually was the son of Mary without the benefit of a human father. So that title, seed of the woman, really works nicely there. And in the case of Satan, in this imagery, his head was bruised on the cross. Now, I'm not saying literally, but it's the picture of a man versus a serpent, where they're at odds. They're entering into a conflict, and the serpent's trying to bite, and the man's using his foot, and he stomps on the head of the serpent, and that's not going to be very healthy for the serpent. It crushes the head of the serpent. Whereas in the process, he is bitten. So there's injuries on both sides. In this way, Satan suffered a defeat by what took place on the cross. That was a victory for the Lord and for his people. But in providing the victory, in gaining the victory, his heel was bruised on the cross. That is his humanity. So that one describes a fatal wound, the other describes his humanity, which eventually rose again from the dead 3 days later. So one was, I say it this way, one was eternal, one was temporary. But I can't help but think that maybe there was a bit more. What you're looking here is of a representation. Now, on the left, you actually have somebody's heel bone. And on the right, you have a reconstruction of what that heel would look like if it was still attached to the foot. And this is an example of someone who was crucified. We actually found their remains. Now, this isn't Jesus. I'm just talking about how they did crucifixion. And he was crucified in the land of Israel. And his ossuary, that is his grave, it's like a box they would put the bones in, was located back in the 1960s, and it showed this. And I think it's been since that time, maybe earlier, the remains of another crucified individual was found, this time in England, and the crucifixion regarding the foot was again the same way, where the nail went through his heel. Now, it's because of this that I think maybe, as we're looking at the symbolism of this prophecy, maybe it's not just symbolic, maybe it's actual. Maybe his heel was bruised. Now, I don't want to be dogmatic there because I can't tell. We just have a few examples. I'm not sure how it was done in the case of Jesus, but I've looked at this and I think, could it be that he was both literally and figuratively having that bruised heel by what he did on our behalf? Let's finish up in chapter 3. Then the Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us," and notice the us is there again, the plural, "knowing good and evil, and now he might stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat, and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he was taken." He was supposed to be cultivating ground, but no longer will it be in the Garden of Eden. Now it will be outside of the garden. So he drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, this is why I think there was an entrance there, an entrance and an exit. At the east of the Garden of Eden, he stationed the cherubim. Cherubim is like some sort of mighty one, a mighty angel. Notice it's plural there. The cherubim and the flaming sword, which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. And so he's driven out from the garden. And let me just say, the rest of the Old Testament, no, let me just say it this way. The rest of the Bible is going to be asking the question, how does he get back again? That's going to be an idea that will be with us throughout the rest of the Bible. So we have Adam. Now remember, this is telling the story of Adam, but it's the people of Israel who are reading the story for the first time. That's the audience. Adam is the character. The people of Israel are the audience. In Adam's case, he's been banished from the garden. The people of Israel, as they are reading, if Moses is the author, and I believe he was, they are reading this after having come out of Egypt. They've departed from this garden-like land, and where the Nile just makes everything green and lush and fertile. And now they're in the Sinai wilderness, out in the desert. They're out in the waste place. They're out in a place that looks anything but a garden. In the case of Adam, he leaves the garden by the eastern route, and likewise, they have left Egypt by the eastern route and gone out into the Sinai wilderness. And as they got to Sinai, they were instructed on the building of a tabernacle that served, I think, as a sort of a scale model of what they had lost and how they would eventually come back to it. That the tabernacle represented the garden from which they had been banished. You see, when you went to the tabernacle, it had one way in, it had a wall around it, just like a garden would, one way in, one way out, and the entryway faced toward the east. And when you came in, There was a flaming altar. Now, they didn't have a flaming cherubim with an angel, but a flaming altar where death would take place. This is where they would sacrifice the animals. And you went a little further, and there was a laver of water. You can't have a whole stream of water there on the desert. They don't have that at hand. But there's a laver of water. And then as you go into the tabernacle itself, on the outside curtain and the inside curtains, there would be pictures of cherubim that were stitched into the very fabric. And you would go into that holy place. And once you came in, on your left-hand side, there would be a stylized tree. It's a lampstand, but it's a lampstand shaped like a tree with 7 branches, and it has flowers and leaves and bulbs that are engraved into the fabric, into the inscription, into the very metalwork to make it look like a tree of light, a tree of life. And on your right side, there is a table of showbread, and then there's another altar, an altar of incense, and then the veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the outer place of holiness. And when you would go into that, there would be the tabernacle, where again you'd have the statues of 2 cherubim. And they don't have a sword. They are representing the very presence of God. They are looking toward the middle, not toward the lid, but toward the middle, where there's an empty spot which represents the place where God is. He's the invisible God, so you can't see him. We're not going to build a image of him. Don't do that. But this represents the throne of God, from which not just the people of Israel, from which all mankind had been banished. And yet they are going to be given a way to come into the presence of God through the shedding of blood, through the sacrifice that will be a sacrifice for sins. And we'll see that in the coming chapters. Yes, mankind has been banished from the garden, but yes, a way has been made to bring him back into the presence of God.